Chapter 10. Evolution of the Two Instincts in the State. Only a few words will be required to show and outline that the principles we have been considering apply with the same force and pertinency to aggregated humanity, to tribes, communities, states, and nations. Thus, when states are formed by an aggregation of communities, it is the result of a process of reasoning by which the conclusion is reached that the interests of each and all will be best subserved by a union of forces, financial and military. That is to say, the principle of self-preservation enters into the transaction in its incipiency, the higher emotions having little or nothing to do with it at that time, but reason teaches them that inasmuch as their interests are identical, and mutual protection is their object, they should cultivate a mutual regard, forbearance, and helpfulness. Churches, schools, colleges, and eleemosynary institutions soon follow, with all that they imply, all being the outgrowth of an intelligent understanding of the best interests of the community or the state. In due time, however, after these intelligent actions have been performed for several generations, they are converted into instincts and are then inherited. The altruistic instinct has become a factor in the national character, and it has become an emotional impulse of supreme potency. We call it patriotism and define the word as love of country. It is that, but in its higher implications it is infinitely more, for it comprises not only a sentimental love of one's country, prompting obedience to its laws and to acts promotive of its welfare, but to the sacrifice of property and life itself in defense of its existence, its rights, and its institutions. The patriotism of a free and enlightened people is, in fact, one of the best illustrations of the harmonious development of the two instincts. The self-regarding element enters into it, in that protection of the whole includes protection of its component parts, and this applies alike to life and to property. All acts having for their object a provision for the common defense, or for the promotion of national prosperity, must be set down to the credit of the self-regarding instinct, although the altruistic element may enter into many of them. But it will invariably be found that a free and enlightened people, after a few generations of autonomous government, are more strongly moved by altruistic impulses than by those that are purely self-regarding, and that those acts which inure to the benefit of future generations far overbalance the others in number and importance. It is sometimes difficult to determine when the patriotic altruism of such a people ceases to be prompted solely by an enlightened reason and is converted into a national instinctive emotion. But the time always comes when that question is no longer in doubt, and that time is when war with a foreign nation is imminent. When such a time comes, if 1,000 volunteers offer their services for every one that is called for, we may rest assured that patriotism in that country is a national instinct, and with that people altruism is the dominant national impulse. I mention war as a test of the instinctive character of patriotism, for the reason that until the representative manhood of a nation is put to that test it can never be surely known whether or not the patriotic impulse is stronger than the instinct of self-preservation. If it is, we may safely conclude that in that nation the two instincts have been harmoniously developed, and that altruism, or other regarding, with all its implications of progressive development of civilization, is the dominating national characteristic. Patriotism, like every other virtue, may be misdirected, but the fact remains that it is essentially altruistic. It is, moreover, fairly representative of progressive civilization, for it is capable of indefinite expansion, and it keeps exact pace with the development of human intelligence and national virtue. The latter proposition is demonstrated by the fact that in those nations, which enjoy the highest degree of Christian civilization and whose governments are the most altruistic, the patriotism of the people is the most intense and practical in peace and potent in war. That it is capable of indefinite expansion is evidenced by the history of the world. Having its origin in the parental instinct, it began with the primordial cell as a primary instinct. In the process of development, secondary instincts were evolved, resulting in gregarious habits in the more intelligent animals. When man appeared and began to organize the basis of human society, the equivalent of what we call patriotism was among the first of the secondary instincts developed. It had its basis in the two primordial instincts, but its first manifestations were the results of an intelligent adaptation to environment. This was eventually converted into an instinct and became an inheritable attribute of mind. Now, every step in the progressive development of human government is taken in precisely the same way. Thus, When tribes are aggregated into communities, it is primarily the result of an intelligent appreciation of the fact that self-preservation for the tribe and security for future generations will be best provided for by a union of forces. The same is true of every new aggregation of interests and forces by which states and nations are formed under normal conditions. Reason points out the path of safety for present and future generations, and inculcates a policy promotive of internal harmony and mutual forbearance and regard. These are the suggestions of the aggregated national intelligence. At first, however, there are conflicting interests which give rise to local selfishness, and thus counter-suggestions are made which retard the general acceptance of the situation. But in due time the interests are harmonized, and the advantages of union become manifest to all. The natural result is a growing regard for the institutions that afford protection to life and property and provide for the comfort and prosperity of future generations. And this is the emotion that eventually develops into that passionate love of country which has been designated as patriotism. The suggestions of reason have been fully accepted by the subjective mind. The resultant acts have been performed until they have become habitual. A secondary instinct has been created, and henceforth it is a potent element in the national character, and, like all other instincts and attributes of the subjective mind, it is the heritage of posterity. It seems evident, therefore, that the higher manifestations of the attributive mind which we call patriotism are much more than a mere emotional sentiment of love for one's country, for the latter may be inspired by the associations of childhood, by the memories of parents and the companions of youth, or even by the memories of the beautiful scenery of one's native land, the orchard, the meadow, the deep-tangled wildwood, or any loved spot which one's infancy knew. No one is exempt from the emotions inspired by such fond recollections. But that emotion is not patriotism in the higher sense of the word. It has little or nothing in common with that lofty spirit of self-abnegation which prompts one to sacrifice all that he has, even life itself, for the preservation of the institutions of his country. Such a spirit can only be inspired by an intelligent appreciation of institutions that are worth preserving. Hence it is that the higher attribute of mind which is called patriotism exists as a national characteristic of the people of any country in exact proportion to the beneficence of its institutions and the ability of its people to appreciate them intelligently. When this universal truth is considered in connection with the fact that the higher patriotism we have described is in itself essentially altruistic, the conclusion is inevitable that the emotion possesses a more profound significance than is expressed or implied by the term by which it is designated. It is, in fact, the national or collective expression or manifestation of the evolutionary instinct, the progressive principle, the constant force, the impellent energy, creative, progressive, and essentially altruistic, that developed the organic world from the monarch to man, and constitutes the motive power that impels mankind onward and upward in the path of progressive development in every sphere of legitimate human activity. If this proposition is true, there are two evidences of its truth that we might reasonably expect to find. First, we should be sure to find its highest manifestation in those nations that are in the very van of human progress, for there is necessarily a causal connection between them. That is to say, we might expect to find the people of those nations whose governments most clearly and practically recognize the rights of man to be the most enlightened, enterprising, and progressive in peace, and in war the bravest and the most devoted and self-sacrificing. Secondly, we should have a right to expect that eventually this same altruistic emotion would refuse to be circumscribed by the limitations of race, color, or geographical boundaries, and that, on occasion, we should find the people of great nations moved by one common altruistic impulse to right the wrongs of suffering humanity in other lands than their own. The impulse, it is true, might be misdirected. All missionary effort is liable to be misdirected and carried forward on impracticable lines. I am not arguing that question in reference to any real or supposable case. The point is that the impulse is real, that it is altruistic in its very essence, that its existence as an individual or a national characteristic reaches out toward universal altruism and points to that goal as the manifest destiny of humanity. Again, it may be said that selfishness is the mainspring of missionary effort alike in individuals and in nations, that the individual missionary is inspired by a contemplation of his salary, and a nation by the prospect of increased trade and commerce. It is true that as long as man is compelled to eat in order to live, Selfish considerations are liable to enter into all human transactions, however altruistic they may be in their essential nature. That particular necessity of animal existence, however, was one of the active agencies of organic evolution, and in man it is still the primary incentive to exertion. Emerson, I think it was Emerson, once remarked that every man is as lazy as he dares to be. He might well have added that the same is true of every sentient creature. Even the little busy bee, who in northern latitudes is compelled to improve each shining hour in order to provide food for the winter, utterly refuses to do anything of the kind after he is transported to a land of perpetual sunshine and flowers. Point one: the truth of the remark, so far as it pertains to man, is illustrated by the fact that in isolated parts of the earth, where the natural supply of food is abundant, as in sundry tropical islands of the Pacific Ocean, men have ceased from warfare and become gentle and docile without rising above the intellectual level of savagery. To it must be added that this particular gentle savage has also ceased from work, and for him a breech clout is a wardrobe of exceptional extravagance. He is just as lazy as he dares to be, and he dares everything because he has nothing to lose by idleness and nothing to gain by work. He is peaceful because he has no rights worth invading. Spontaneous nature supplies his daily food. In winter he is clothed with the sun, and his summer garment is the shade of the tree that drops his daily bread into his open mouth. Of course he is gentle and docile. Of course he is lazy. Of course he has not risen above the intellectual level of savagery, and of course he never will rise above that level. An exceptionally unfavorable environment has deprived him of that incentive to activity that is inspired by the instinct of self-preservation alike in the lower animals and in mankind, namely, the necessity of struggling for daily sustenance. It is this necessity for food that causes animals and savages to fight and to work. But it is also this carrot necessity that sharpens their wits and develops their understanding. And in the highest civilization it is still a powerful agency for the development of the human intellect. 4. Whilst peaceful competition in trade and commerce has largely taken the place of brute force as a means of supplying the necessities of mankind, it requires the exercise of all the powers of the mind to achieve success. The necessity for procuring subsistence, therefore, is not only constant and imperative in itself, but it compels the cultivation of the intellectual faculties. And in the larger operations of trade and foreign commerce, it facilitates intercourse with the world at large and promotes harmonious foreign relations. These results, in turn, directly or indirectly, are promotive of the development of altruistic emotions in a constantly broadening field, the grand result of which must be to bring about, on a national scale, the normally harmonious relation between the instinct of self-preservation and the altruistic, progressive, evolutionary instinct that moves the world toward the final goal of universal altruism. No, trade with foreign nations is not incompatible with the exercise of the most exalted beneficence toward them. On the contrary, it affords the greatest facilities for the establishment and maintenance of such relations. Besides, nations, as well as individuals, must be prosperous before they can be altruistic. The instinct that accumulates provides the only means for the exercise of benevolence. The hand of charity would be useless if it could not grasp the gifts she would bestow. The bounties which God bestows upon his children are taken from a full store. On the other hand, it should be remembered by nations as well as individuals that God requires a strict accounting for the uses for which his bounty is employed, and that to whomsoever much is given, of him shall much be required. Trade in itself, when honestly and properly conducted, with due regard to the rights of all concerned, is a happy illustration of the harmonious development of the two instincts, the self-regarding and the other-regarding. For whilst it furnishes subsistence for those who are engaged in it, the surplus accumulations invariably redound to the benefit of others. The accumulation of wealth, therefore, cannot properly be discouraged, but it will be a happy day for humanity when all millionaires shall hold it to be disgraceful to die rich. 1. It is an encouraging sign of the times that the example has been set by one who is daily giving evidence of the sincerity of his words by munificent benefactions on lines of purest altruism. I have now briefly indicated the lines upon which nations progress from savagery to civilization, from instinctive self-regarding to instinctive altruism. I have shown that nations and individuals are governed by the same psychological laws, and that those laws are the same that prevail in the life of the lower animals. The law of suggestion has been the moving agency of psychic development from the time when a brain was developed in animals until now. The process of development in animals has been by intelligent adjustments to environment, which, by being frequently performed, have become automatic in the individual and then inherited till they become automatic habits in the race, remains, or, in other words, until they are transformed into secondary instincts. When man appeared, he was governed by the same law of development, and his whole character is made up of hereditary instincts thus acquired, plus the sum of his individual acquirements. I have shown that the psychical character of aggregated humanity, whether of tribes, communities, states, or nations, is developed in precisely the same way and under precisely the same laws. That is to say, it has been shown that secondary instincts are formed, first by intelligent adjustments to environment, resulting in habits that eventually become converted into instincts, and are then inherited till they become habits in the state or nation, and that the tendency or trend of these developments is always onward and upward toward perfection, that in the organic world the final goal was man, that in men and nations the final goal is universal altruism. I have shown that behind this process of development there exists, inherent in all sentient creatures, from the primordial cell to man, a constant, forceful, impellent energy that irresistibly impels all living beings forward in the lines of progressional development, that this energy is embodied, so to speak, in a primary instinct, that in its every form of manifestation, from the monarch to man, it is essentially altruistic in that it constantly prompts to acts which redound to the benefit of future generations, that it is normally paramount to all other instincts, including the instinct of self-preservation, and hence, that the most potent psychic force in nature, normally developed, irresistibly impels mankind toward the final consummation which was foreshadowed by the man of Nazareth, universal altruism. It remains to show that the higher attributes of the character of man, namely, his moral and religious nature, are developed under the same laws and by the same processes that we have been considering. The next chapter will be devoted to a brief examination of that process.